Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, chapter 3, Halacha 5. Just to sum up this halacha, really the key idea is going to be if the seller of, in this case it's going to be trees, if the seller of trees is going to have to give Peah even if he didn't start the harvest before he goes and he sells the trees. So in this particular case, it's talking about something like a tree nursery, and there's lots of immature trees that perhaps they're 4 years old, maybe they're 5 years old, and they have fruit on it, and the person wants to go and sell the trees to other people for them to come dig it up and bring it to their field. So the question is going to come about, well, is the seller discharging the obligation of Peah to the buyer for these new trees? That's really what this is going to be coming up. In other words, how could it he sells the trees, and is the buyer going to get Peah to be transferred? Okay, so does that obligation gets transferred? And the other thing is that Rabbi Yochanan is going to equate this to the first fleece. It's the mitzvah of Reshit Hagez, where the person goes and he has his flock of sheep and he shears it, and he's supposed to give a part of it to the Kohanim. And really what this is going to be talking about is it's going to be talking about how the transfer of the obligation is going to be the same for Peah and also for this mitzvah that you're giving the gift to the Kohen. And, the ownership of it is biblically obligated, so that in the case of the wool, the Kohen has this ownership interest in the wool that's in there before you get to use it for yourself. And also the Peah, the poor person has ownership of this portion of the crop before, somewhere in there, and has to get separated out before you can use it. And so, in this halacha, Rabbi Yochanan is going to equate the two, and is going to look at basically that the rulings on how this is going to work for both of those are going to be parallel. So let's get into it. This is a really interesting halacha. The Mishnah starts off. It says, if one sells young fruit trees within his field, the buyer gives Peah for each and every tree by itself. And Rabbi Yehuda says, when is this so? When the owner of the field did not leave over any of the trees for himself. However, if the owner of the field left over even one tree for himself in the field, he gives one portion of Peah for all. So let's unpack this Mishnah and see what's going on so that we can understand the halacha. So one of these cases here, it's pointing out that it's selling the Mishnah says, if one sells young fruit trees within the field. So he's not selling the land, he's selling the fruit trees. And again, it's this idea that the guy is going to sell it and somebody's going to come dig it up and transport it to another field, much like how a modern nursery operates today. So the land still goes with the person who owns the field. He's only selling the tree. He's not selling the land, and he's not selling the nourishment within the land. The buyer is only buying the tree. And so he's expected to uproot this tree and transplant it somewhere else. But for whatever reason, before transplanting the tree, the buyer wishes to harvest the fruit. And now the question is going to come up, well, how do you handle Peah for that? That's really what this is talking about. nursery. It's a nursery, and there's lots of trees, and the buyer now wants to harvest the fruit before he hauls it away. Maybe it'll be easier to haul away without the fruit because he already harvested it. And what happens to the peah? That's really the question. And how do we handle peah for that? There's a lot of halachic issues because one of the things here is that, well, did you transfer, when you sold it, did you transfer the peah obligation to the buyer? That's one of the main ideas here, but there's other subset ideas here too. In other words, you have this buyer who does not own the land in between the trees, and there's nothing to connect them. And so, because there's nothing to connect them, effectively, you have to give a peah for each tree because each tree is effectively like a field. So it's a very interesting point there. This is a case where now the ownership of the land creates a barrier. It creates a division where it's effectively like creating a new field. So this tree is basically an island by itself, surrounded by land that somebody else owns. The person who has the tree nursery owns, and because it's not connected to anything, that tree is by itself obligated to its own peah. And we know that had the person transferred the land as well, then the other trees would be connected because the land and the other trees would be connected. But this is not the case. The land was not sold. It was just the tree that's sold. So that's a very deep idea that this tree by itself is now considered a separate field for peah because the land didn't change ownership, and that isolates the tree. And because that's isolated by itself, it's like its own field. Very deep idea. We know that if the buyer did own the land, then it would unify the trees that were in this area. But again, this is the case where it doesn't. And this sharpens our mind to be like, okay, I understand how this land ownership is working in a deeper way for not just what's going to happen with peah, but all sorts of other things that's going to come up in halachot as well. So very, very interesting insight here. One of the things about this Mishnah and the halacha is that if you look in Chullin and the Bavli in 138a and b, you're going to see a lot of parallels for these. So if you want to get some other insights, you can look over there and get parallel sugyas for this and parallel cases for this. So the Mishnah is talking about this other thing from a commentary from the Rosh, also from 138a. And the Rosh is saying over there that this ruling about the owner not having the land and it being its own field, that this is going to apply because the buyer does not even possess the rights to have the trees receive nourishment from the ground, since they were sold to be uprooted. And this implies that if he did possess that right, the trees would all be considered one field, even if he did not actually own the intervening land. So that's another interesting insight that the Rosh is going to be saying about the ownership, that it's basically like its own field by itself, because the owner didn't have the intervening trees, and that would keep it by itself. The Rosh is saying something a little different. He's saying that the reason that this is like its own peah by itself, it's like its own field, is not because of the ownership of the land, but because there's no right for the person to keep the tree in the land. He doesn't own the nourishment rights, and because he doesn't own the nourishment rights, he's up, and the understanding is that the new owner is gonna dig this thing up and take it away, because again, you're not buying, this is not a permanent type situation. This is, you're here and you're digging it up maybe the same day, but it has fruit on it. You want to get rid of the fruit, but you have to leave Peah. So how do you handle this? Um, they're they're putting this in here because there's a lot of subset issues that's going to make us think about and understand Peah in a much richer and deeper way. And that's why these cases are in here. Um, one of the one of the things about this that connects is that we know that with nourishment of the soil, that if if you have a tree and the tree is gaining nourishment from someone else's soil, that you're not allowed to bring bikurim for that plant. In fact, it's considered stealing. You were actually stealing from someone else. Notice how sensitive the Hachamim are, and how sensitive they are. That you're taking something. You'd think, well, the nourishment of the soil is not that big a deal, and they're saying, no, you're stealing, and because you're stealing, and because it's not your land, that you can't even use this to bring bikurim, and it's not subject to bikurim because it's something that's from theft and it's not your land, because the nourishment matters in helping to determine the ownership. Part of the ownership is not just the title to the land, but also the nutrients and everything that's within the land. And so that if you're taking all those nutrients away with the tree, then you lose you don't have the right to bring bikurim, and it's considered to be a form of theft. It is theft, and the case here is that you're digging it up before it has the chance to get nourishment from the land. So you're digging it up right away, and you're going to be taking the bikurim. So it says, well, when is this so? The Mishnah says, when the owner of the field did not leave over any of the trees for himself. In other words, this is talking about where he's selling off all the fruit trees, all of these trees in the nursery, and this is what Rabbi Yudah is saying, and there's a qualification. It says, however, if the owner of the field left over even one tree in the field for himself, he gives one portion of Peah for them all. So let me explain this part with the Mara Fulda, and here's how the Mara Fulda says it. He says that in this case, it is the obligation of the seller, rather than the buyer, to take Peah for the trees he sold. And the reason for this is going to be explained later in the Gemara, but since the seller owns the land between the trees, all the trees constitute for him a single field. Thus, he leaves only one portion of Peah for them all. There's a few explanations of this. I found four main explanations for this. The Mara Fulda is gonna follow the Rosh, and he's gonna say that basically what's going on here is that like the Bavli and Chullin 138a, they're gonna say that Rabbi Yudah's ruling in the Mishnah applies only if the seller started harvesting before the sale, and they're looking at the wording of the Mishnah, likotzer, in the Mishnah of harvesting, and that again is going to be interpreted as a term that's ordinarily used to harvesting grain, not harvesting fruit. So what's gonna when you look at Chullin 138a and you look at the Rashi there, he's gonna present this different interpretation of the Mishnah based upon using the word likutzur in the Mishnah, which is again normal for harvesting a grain field. And so Rashi is going to interpret that to mean that you have these trees sprouting out of a grain field, and that the Mishnah is not talking about an orchard, but it's rather talking about trees that sprouted on their own in the middle of a grain field, and the owner does not want these trees in the grain field. and so he sells them to be uprooted from the field. That's what the Rashi explains. And the Mishnah is ruling that the buyer must take Peah for each tree separately, and that's only because each tree with each tree there's another crop growing there next to it, which is the grain, which has a different Peah obligation. So that because the tree is surrounded by this other thing with a Peah obligation being the grain, according to the Rashi, that's why you would need to have a separate Peah for the tree. So the plot thickens, and so when you look at some of the other variations, like what the Rambam's approach, Rambam has a different approach, and when you look at it from the Hilchos Matanos Aniyim 318, he's going to assume that that this term about kotzer does not refer to trees at all, but to edible plant roots of a variety that is obligated to Peah. And so then he's saying that, when the field is being spoken about in the Mishnah, where it's using the word sedeh and likotzor, that actually the Mishnah's wording is precise, and that when you're talking about harvesting these roots, then they do use the word likotzor. And so the Rambam is explaining in his Hilchos Matanos Aniyim that the seller did not sell isolated plant roots to one buyer. Rather, he sold sections of the field containing these plant roots to different buyers. And the Mishnah is ruling that a separate Peah must be given for each and every section by itself, since each section is owned by a different buyer. So that's another way to read this. I'm going to take the view that, like the Mara Fulda and the Rosh and the Rosh, in explaining that this is going to be trees that are growing there. In other words, the Mishnah is referring to the trees growing as a sedeh. Uses the word sedeh, which is normally going to be used for a grain field, not a field of trees. But in the conversation in the Bavli and Chullin 138a, it's going to discuss whether Rabbi Yehuda's ruling for this Mishnah applies only if the seller started harvesting before the sale, and if that's going to also be applying to perhaps an orchard, so that it's not just a tree sprouting in the middle of a grain field. So when we look at the first sugya, first part of the sugya, the Gemara is going to try to figure out the scope of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling that if the seller retains even one tree, he gives Peah for all the trees he sold. And the sugya begins. He says, "This so far, we would prefer to explain the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda as applying only when the seller began to harvest fruit before the sale, and when the original owner." Mara Fulda says like this. He says, when the original owner begins to harvest fruit from the field, he becomes obligated to give Peah for the entire field. In other words, he's triggered this obligation now to give it. And it's that act of harvesting that triggers that obligation for the entire field. And he says, therefore, when he later sells some of the trees, it is certainly understandable that he remains obligated to give for the entire field, even for the trees that he sold, because he was never released from his original Peah obligation. And this is assuming, of course, that he left for himself at least one tree in the field from which to give Peah from the other trees. So that, let's say there's some trees that still exist that have fruit on it, and he sold some of the other trees. Well, the buyer of those new trees did not buy the Peah obligation. The Peah obligation stays with the seller, and he's got to leave even for the entire field, even including what was sold, from the trees that he currently has ownership of what the seller currently has ownership of, so that the buyer is allowed to take off all the fruit, and from his new trees that he just purchased, he doesn't have to leave Peah. And from those new trees that he purchased, somewhere on the seller's standing trees has to be given Peah for the sold trees. That's what this is getting at. So the Mara Fulda continues, says, when, however, the original owner did not begin to harvest any fruit before the sale, there is no readily apparent reason that he should separate Peah for the trees that the buyer acquires. So, so the question is going to come that, well, what happens if he didn't harvest any of the trees yet? There's no harvest going on for the standing trees from the seller or from the trees that the buyer is purchased. So nothing's happened with harvest to trigger it yet. So what's going to happen here? So the sugya continues. It says, but maybe it applies even when he did not begin to harvest at that time. And so we have this inquiry. And the Gemara is going to now come up with this parallel case and this parallel Mishnah in Chullin, chapter 11, Halacha 2, and that's going to correspond to 135 in the Bavli. And here's what it says. It says, Sugya says, let us derive it, the law, from the following Mishnah. If one brought the fleece of his fellow Jew's flock before the shearing, if the seller left over some fleece for himself, the seller is obligated to give Rishis Hagez for all the fleece. So in other words, when someone shears the sheep, part of the fleece has to be given to the Kohen. We know that. This is the priestly gift. This is the Rishis Hagez, the first of the fleece. And the Mishnah is going to be talking about who has the obligation in the case of a sale. What's going to happen? So it's effectively going to be saying that he is obligated, that the seller is obligated to give for all of the fleece, even for the fleece that he sold. So, but now it's going to say, and that's going to be from the fleece that's going to remain in his possession. So in other words, let's say he, like the Peah, he sold half the flock, and he didn't shear the half that he sold. Well, somewhere in the half that he sold, the original obligation to give the priestly gift still belongs in the remaining sheep. And we know that Rabbi Yochanan is inferring that the way it works for Peah also works for the first fleece as well. In other words, that there's this thing inside of the produce that belongs to someone else that you have to take out before you're allowed to use it. That's what's going on here. And that's why Zerayim is a little bit different than with all of the orders of Nizikin, because Nizikin you have laws of ownership when you actually have ownership of the thing free and clear. But here, when you don't really have ownership yet, because inside of there is Peah, or inside of there is a first fleece, or inside of produce will be, the gifts for the Kohanim and the Leviim and the Meiser that you have to bring to the Meiser Sheni you have to bring to the temple. So you have to take all these things out before you're left with something that's finished, that's free and clear. So Rabbi Yochanan is basically going to be saying that this halacha is basically going to be like the Peah, and that's how we're going to be able to understand both of these in a richer way, and we're going to know from here for over there. That's why we're talking about this, because it's going to function the same way. In other words, the owner has some sheep, and part of the fleece he has to give over to the Kohen, and he starts to shear the flock, and then what's going to happen? Who's going to have to give the the first fleece gift to the Kohanim? Is it going to be the buyer? Is that obligation to transfer to the buyer? Well, we can see here, it's probably not. It's going to generally it's going to stay with the seller, particularly if there's fleece that still remains in existence with something that he either has already shorn or which he hasn't shorn yet. So let's look at this sugya, the rest of the sugya. It says the seller is obligated to give the gift for the fleece, for all the fleece, from the fleece that remains in his possession. But if he did not leave over any fleece, the buyer is now obligated to give the Rishis Hagez. And Rabbi Yeremiah said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this Mishnah follows the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda. So what happens if, in this case, the seller sells all of the flock, and there's no fleece left over, and there's no more flock that stays in the seller's possession. So let's look at what the Mara Fulda is saying. And again, the parallel for this is in Hulin 138a. And it's saying like this. It says that when one starts to shear the flock, he does not become obligated to give the Rishis Hagez for the entire flock. Rather, he becomes obligated for each fleece only when it is actually shorn, assuming enough is shorn to trigger the obligation. Thus, whether or not the seller sheared some of the sheep before the sale makes no difference regarding those sheep he did not shear. So over here, what we see is that Rabbi Yehuda taught in the Mishnah that a seller who leaves over some of the trees for himself must give Peah for all the trees. And so too, in the case of the fleece, a seller who leaves over some of the fleece for himself must also give this Rishis Hagez for all the fleece. So let's look at a parallel ruling to help resolve this inquiry. And here's how the sugya goes. It says, is there a difference in the case of Rishis Hagez between when he started to shear his flock before the sale and when he did not start to shear it? And basically, no. So the sugya says, so too in the case of Peah, there should be no difference between when he started to harvest the trees before the sale and when he did not start to harvest them. So, in other words, the ruling Rabbi Yehuda is applying applies even if the seller did not start to harvest the trees before the sale. So, let's look at the Mara Fulda for an explanation. It says like this. It says that the statement of Rabbi Yochanan proves that Rabbi Yehuda's teaching is not limited to the case where the seller started harvesting before the sale. And for the proposed limitation, is going to assume that the reason Rabbi Yehuda is that when the original owner begins to harvest the field, he becomes obligated to take Peah for the whole field. Now, however, that Rabbi Yochanan informed us with the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda applies even for Rishis Hagez, we see that this cannot be Rabbi Yehuda's reason. For even if the seller would start shearing the sheep before the sale, he does not become obligated to give the first fleece for all the fleece. Since Rabbi Yehuda's teaching nevertheless applies there, this teaching evidently applies even when the seller did not become obligated before the sale. And this applies even in the case of Peah, even if the seller did not begin to harvest. Now, I just want to point out here, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, in the commentary here, is saying that the Bavli Chullin 138a and b are drawing the opposite conclusion from this line of reasoning. And for the Bavli is certain that Rabbi Yuda's ruling does not apply in the case if the seller did not harvest the fruit before the sale, and on the basis of that, it rejects Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of the Mishnah for the first fleece, and that's going to be based on Rabbi Yehuda. But there are some alternative interpretations of the Yerushalmi which accord with the Bavli's conclusion. You can find them in the Sidei Yeshua and the Toldos Yitzhak. So those are two sources for a way to read it where it's not contradictory at all. So perhaps it doesn't need to be contradictory at all. So here we see that what's happening when the original owner is going to be selling some of the product and leaving some for himself, and what's going to be happening when none of it was harvested, and what's going to be happening when part of it's harvested, right? So here, basically, Rabbi Yehuda is applying this if the seller also did not start to harvest the trees before the sale. In other words, he's saying that in the sugya, so too in the case of Peah, there should be no difference between when he started to harvest the trees before the sale and when he did not start to do it. So in other words, he's saying that the seller is still obligated. So what's going to happen now is that the Gemara is basically demonstrating that Rabbi Yehuda is requiring the seller to give Peah even if he didn't start to harvest before the sale. And it's going to become necessary to explain that reason to try to understand Rabbi Yehuda's reason so that basically, because again, this obligation for giving Peah is a biblical obligation that's in there. And the question comes, well, can you just sell that obligation off and get rid of it? And the sages are coming along and saying, no, it's your field. The Torah is written in a way where it's saying your field. And so even if you sold it later, before you sold it, it was still your field, and you are still obligated to give the Peah. You can't sell that out. So the sugya is gonna go on with this to try to give a reason for Rabbi Yehuda's ruling. What is the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? It is because the obligation to give Peah from the harvested crop resides in the standing crop that remains at the end. In other words, it's saying that what's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? Is it because the obligation to give Peah for the harvested crop resides in the standing crop that remains at the end? In other words, that we know that from the Torah and the language of the Torah that part of it has to remain standing at the end. So is that where, in other words, from what the Torah is saying about you leave the standing crop unfinished at the end, is that why you're getting up to this? In other words, is that where it's coming from? I want to read from the Mara Fulda to help, because he writes a lot on this to try to get an understanding of what's going on with this idea of the standing crop that remains at the end, and could this be the source for the obligation to give Peah from the harvested crop? So the Mara Fulda says like this. He says, when the original owner sells some trees and leaves over others for himself, according to this explanation, the Torah requires him to take Peah from the ones he left for himself because these are the ones that remain at the end. So for the basic law of Peah, says the Mara Fulda, is that one must leave Peah from the crop that remains at the end for all the crop that grew in the field. And just as Peah is not taken from the harvested crop because it has not remained in the field, so too Peah is not taken from the sold crop because it has not remained in his possession. So both of these are examples of crops that have not remained at the end. So we continue here with the Mara Fulda's commentary, and it says, well, one might wonder, and we've learned in the previous Mishnah that when a field is divided between two people before the harvest, each one of them is obligated to give Peah for his half. As we explained there, the basis for this ruling is that since the Peah obligation takes effect at the start of the harvest, and at the time the field had two owners, each owner becomes separately obligated for his half. And now, in the case under discussion, here it is similar, apparently similar, to that case, because here the trees were sold before the harvest, and and thus they and thus here also at the time of harvest there are two separate owners. So why do we not say that each owner becomes obligated to give Peah for his own trees? And I would like to jump in and answer that. So what we were talking about in chapter 3, Halacha 4, was where the two people inherited a field or had joint ownership at a point, and then they decided to split. So the case here is different, where because the person who's coming in to buy this tree later never had an ownership interest in it, and so that's a big difference. In other words, in the last case, the person when they split, he had ownership in both, some theoretical ownership in both parts of the field. They just decided to split it up, but they both had ownership together. And this is a different case because this is where person A has ownership, and then person B, who's the buyer, never had ownership at all, and then is getting it. So to continue with the Mara Fulda's insight here, he says that granted that the obligation to give Peah resides in the crop that remains at the end, but the principle does not determine whether there is a Peah obligation. It determines only how a given Peah obligation applies. So in our situation, says Amara Fulda, each owner should give a separate Peah obligation for his trees, and each one of them should give his Peah from the fruit that remains at the end. And the answer is that there is a fundamental distinction between the case here and the case in the last Mishnah. In the last Mishnah, each owner became obligated to give a separate Peah because each of them owns half of the field, and each half is considered a separate field for Peah. And in the case under discussion here, the buyer does not own any part of the field. He only bought the trees that grew in the field without buying any of the land. And thus the buyer of the trees, these trees are not considered to be a separate field for Peah. Rather, they are all part of one field that is still owned by the seller. Consequently, the field only attains the Peah obligation when it is harvested, and this obligation resides in the crop that remains at the end. So that's another way to explain it. So then the sugya is gonna ask another question about what is this obligation to give Peah? Where do we know this? How are we deriving this? What's Rabbi Yehuda getting this from? So the first question was, so what is the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? Is it because the obligation to give Peah from the harvested crop resides in the standing crop that remains at the end? So that's one question. The second question of how do we derive Rabbi Yehuda's position would be, or is it because the seller is as one who sells the trees to the buyer without the obligation to give Peah for them? So here's a simple explanation over there from the Rosh, from Chullin from the Rosh. It says that the buyer does not wish to buy property encumbered with a Peah obligation, and therefore the seller accepts upon himself the obligation to give Peah for the sold trees, even though that the Torah does not require him to do so. So, according to the Rosh, that the buyer does not wish to buy this encumbered property with this obligation, and so it's implicitly is he's not buying it that way. So now it's going to go back to trying to understand this point that Rabbi Yochanan's putting in with the first fleece. It says the seller is obligated to give Rishis Hagez for all the fleece from the fleece that remains in his possession. And the Sukkah continues, says, but if he did not leave over any fleece, the buyer is obligated to give the first fleece. And Rabbi Yeremiah said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this Mishnah follows the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda. So what's happening here is that Rabbi Yochanan is putting in this parallel ruling to help resolve this question about Peah. So let's take a look at this part. So the sugya says, could you say there that the seller gives reshis hagiz for the buyer because the obligation of the harvested portion resides in the standing portion that remains at the end? Certainly not. In other words, the point is that how can you say that shorn fleece is gonna be like that same obligation with the unshorn fleece that's remaining in the flock, because the Torah is getting this standing obligation of what's left standing, and you don't have any such thing in the Rishis Hagiz where it says like, oh, you have to leave this corner of the area standing. You don't have that for sheep, right? You have that for the crops. You have to leave a portion that is left unremained, but you don't have that over here for the fleece, right? We have a commonality where you can sell the trees, or you can sell the sheep, or you can sell half of them, and somewhere inside you have a pay obligation that belongs to someone else, in this case the poor, and you have a priestly gift that belongs in the case of the fleece for someone else that belongs. But a little bit different is that the standing portion is not the same. That's not the same for the fleece. So so could you say there that the seller gives the Rishis Hagiz for the buyer because of the obligation of the harvested portion residing in the standing portion at the end? Certainly not. In other words, that's not something that's mentioned in the Torah for the first fleece, but that is something that's mentioned for the crop, and that is a difference between the two. So the sugya is going to continue. It's going to say, rather, the reason the seller gives it for the buyer must be because he sells the fleece to him without an obligation to give Rishis Hagiz. And so too here, the seller must give Peah for the buyer because he sold the trees to him without the obligation to give Peah. So why do these two halachas look the same? It's not because there's a biblical thing about leaving a corner of a field and that's in common for the first fleece. We know that doesn't make any sense, and that's not the case. So how can you come up with the same halachic ruling for selling half your trees or selling half of your flock? Why would the halacha for who gives this obligation be exactly the same? And so the sugya is saying here, it's because the typical way of transactions and selling is like what the Rosh is saying, is that it's not a typical way to sell encumbered property, and that the buyer doesn't want to buy it as an encumbered property. And so too, the person who's buying the flocks doesn't want to buy the obligation, wants to leave it with the seller. It's the seller's problem to deal with it. So the Gemara is going to ask, well, what are the practical differences between these two explanations of Rabbi Yehuda's ruling? And the Gemara is going to present one difference. It's going to say that if the buyer acted contrary to this ruling, in other words, to what the Rosh was pointing out, that you're not buying it with an incumbency. It's not the normal way to buy it. So if the buyer acted contrary to this ruling, says the sugya, and separated Peah from the trees he bought, if you say that the reason for this ruling is because the obligation for the harvested crop resides in the standing crop that remains at the end, then whatever the buyer separated is separated, and the buyer receives no reimbursement for that. But if you say that it is because he is as one who sells him the trees without the obligation to give Peah, then even though the buyer separated Peah, he nevertheless takes money from the seller as reimbursement. So what's happening here? So the Torah, according to this explanation, the Torah does not mandate from whose crop the payer should be given. The seller accepted this obligation upon himself as a monetary obligation to enable the buyer to have all the fruit of the tree he purchased. In other words, that's the normal way that these transactions are occurring. That's what the Rosh is pointing out that the Gemara is trying to say. And again, it's, you're trying to enable the buyer to have all the fruit that he produced, that the tree produced. But therefore, like, if you have this case where the buyer's separating it and he performed the mitzvah properly, so what happens is the seller is going to be obligated to refund him because, in essence, he agreed to cover the cost of the Peah. So the Mara Fulda is going to point out that ordinarily the seller is going to give Peah from his trees because they are considered the crop that remains at the end. When, however, the buyer is going to come and separate it out, and he does the mitzvah, the seller effectively owes the money to cover the cost of the Peah. So in this case, we can see that you have the standing portion of the crop, and the standing portion of crop that has to be left over, right? But in this case, the person came along, he bought these trees, and he took away Peah himself. Well, implicitly they're saying that, hey, the seller owes you the money for that produce because it was supposed to. It's a normal way of contracts to be done, right? What they're trying to say is that here in Eretz Yisrael, when these sales are occurring, this is the normal way that these transactions are occurring. So any deviation where, like, oh, the buyer is now separating out the Peah, effectively the seller is going to owe the money to the buyer because he's the one who separated out. Normally, that's the seller's obligation. That's really what's happening here. So, and the seller is supposed to get reimbursed. Is supposed to reimburse the buyer for that case. Okay, and the Gemara is going to get into another practical difference. If the portion of the seller is burned, if you say that ordinarily the seller gives Peah for the buyer because the obligation for the harvested crop resides in the standing crop that remains in the end, then what is burned is burned. The buyer must give Peah for his portion and bear its cost. So, in other words, if you're saying that the Peah obligation comes because of the standing crop at the end, then you'd say, okay, well, the standing crop got burnt, and the buyer has to give the Peah obligation, and it's his cost, it's his problem. And normally you'd say, well, I would have covered it, but this corner of the crop, got burnt, and it's not there anymore, and so Peah has to be given, and Peah is somewhere in your crop that you purchased, and so you bear the cost of it. So that's one thing. But the sugya is gonna look at it the other way. It's going to say, but if you say that it is because he is as one who sells him the trees without the obligation to give Peah, then even though the seller's portion is burned, the buyer nevertheless takes the money from the seller as reimbursement for the Peah that he separates. So they're saying that really this is the normal way that contracts are done for Peah, okay, and that the derivation for it, they're saying, is not from the standing crop, okay, and just like in the first fleece, there's nothing written in the Torah about leaving the corner of your flock. There's nothing about leaving part of the wool unshorn, and that's going to somehow trigger this obligation for the priestly thing later. No, it's saying that in both cases, what's common about it is not this thing about something about it being left over. In the case of the Rishis Gaze, is nothing like that, so it can't be it, right? So why are the two halachas the same? Why is it when you're making a sale of half your flock or you're making a sale of half of your trees that the obligation is going to be on the seller and not the buyer? It's not from some obligation of leaving the corner. It's because what both halachas have in common with the first fleece and the peah, what it has in common is that it's contracted that way. In other words, that's the normal way to sell it. And so even if the remaining portion gets burnt, the seller still has to reimburse the buyer to separate the peah. The buyer separates the peah because the peah has to be given. It's in there somewhere. But who has the monetary obligation? Well, basically we're saying that the buyer is buying it free and clear of that obligation. He's assuming that it's the seller's obligation to do it. And if the seller can't meet that obligation to either separate out the first fleece or separate out the peah, that it's the obligation financially for him, the seller, to pay the buyer and to reimburse him for the peah that's separated out. So that's a really deep insight on the conclusion. I just want to point out from the Mara Fulda how he's looking at this, and he's saying that there is a contrast to the harvested crop, and it teaches that the harvested crop loses the pay obligation totally, and here it is used in contrast to an unharvested crop, which is deemed to not remain at the end, and that teaches that only initially one should not take peah from it. As we explained, the essential peah obligation remains in this case since the crop is still attached to the ground. Thus, in the case of the Mishnah, if the standing crop is destroyed or otherwise absolved from peah, one does not take peah from the harvested crop. In our case, however, one does take peah from the crop, which was previously said to not remain in the end. So, even though that the crop does not remain in the end, the peah is still obligated to be given from what's left. And in that case, what's left is going to be what the buyer did. But the seller has to reimburse the buyer for that peah obligation. So some really deep, interesting insights to sharpen the mind about land ownership, transfer, property rights, who gives peah, and this other interesting thing about, this is the norm of the way these transactions are done. And so that's what's in common between the selling of the sheep, half the flock, selling half of the trees or half of the grain field, because that's what's in common is that it's not something that's left over. In the case of the first flock, there's nothing left over. That's not something written in the Torah. What is done, though, what is common, is that that's the way that the transactions were done. It was the buyer was always buying something that was free and clear of the obligation. So what I want to just briefly talk about is how important it is to study Chos and Mishpat to sharpen your mind so that in all of your business dealings or anything you're doing with material things between one person and another, you're always acting in a way where you're cutting out theft. And you're always being sensitive to whose property is whose. Even look at the soil and the nutrients of the soil. They're even sensitive to that. So how much more sensitive do we have to be? Thank you so much.